everybody. This is James Diboe on Discovering Season 5, dedicated to original people. And we've got a special guest on today, Mr. Robin Walker. How are you doing, my brother? You all right?
I'm doing very, very well, sir. Pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you back on. We had problems with the audio last time, but we're going to get it right this time anyway. And where we left off last time, we were speaking about the African presence, not just in Africa. We were speaking about it in Asia as well. And also I remember that we were speaking about Sumeria, the oldest civilizations in the world. And some people want to say it's Mesopotamia. So we were going, just to go back to where we left off, with Mesopotamia, Nimrod and Cush, and if you could speak a bit on that.
Yeah, there really was civilization in Mesopotamia. On a modern map, that's ancient Iraq. And a number of civilizations were there. The first one was the Sumerians. And then at a later point, we get the Akkadians. At a later point, we get the Babylonians. At a later point, we get the Assyrians. The oldest one out of those is the Sumerians. And there's also the pre-Sumerian period. Some people call them Ubaidians. And the further back you go, the blacker everybody gets. And there's no controversy here, despite what many Eurocentric scholars would have you believe. The very first person to decipher Sumerian was an Englishman called Sir Henry Rawlinson, and General Sir Henry Rawlinson calls them Cushites. And then his brother, Canon George Rawlinson, calls the Sumerians, as he put it, Cushites who were connected not very remotely with the Negro. And you see the double negative, not very remotely. As everybody knows, a double negative is a positive, connected intimately with Negroes. Now, the question here is what date is the Sumerians? And the very first kings of Sumer is around 3,500 BC, 3,300 BC. That is later than ancient Egypt. Now, some people will tell me, but Robin, isn't ancient Egypt 3,100 BC? And the answer is no. That's when people are using the bogus Edward Meyer, James Henry breasted chronology. And that chronology is popular, but it's nonsense. You simply cannot fit that amount of Egyptian history and cram it in where the first dynasty is 3,100 BC. And when we use a more realistic chronology, the Egyptians themselves place their very first king 5,717 BC. Pharaoh Menes, some people call him Pharaoh Namer. And so that would make ancient Egypt 2,500 years, or certainly 2,000 years at minimum, older than ancient Mesopotamia.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, last time I spoke to you, I remember you told me you actually did the maths as well, I thought that was very interesting. And mentioning about when you talked about the Sphinx also last time, many different dates you see the Sphinx, like Robert Bauval, he came up with 12,500 years ago, and the water erosions were ignored. So, when we're going back to the time of the Sahara Desert, when it were in the desert, when it was lush, these times, I mean, what way have you come up with any civilizations that go back into the Sahara, before the Sahara Desert, that you find as well? So these are late time. Yeah.
Yeah. What I'm aware of is the research that was done at a site called Huan Muhujiaj. And at that site was discovered a mummy. And the mummy, some people call it the Black Mummy Mystery. I don't call it the Black Mummy Mystery.
Libya.
Anything in Africa that's ancient is going to be black anyway. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. So what was found, though, is the scholar was Dr. Savino Dell'Ernia, and he was at the University of Rome, and he concluded that a vast, widespread culture existed that on a modern map would be where Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, Algeria, Libya, and Egypt was before the vast area became a desert. And according to Dr. Dell'Ernia, this culture, the kind of artifacts and so on would show a consistent type of culture. Does that make sense? So they believe it's one culture. Now, it's not a civilization. We're not seeing cities. We're not seeing governments, but we are seeing culture, and we're certainly seeing advanced mummification. And it is believed that the Saharan mummification is at least 1,000 years older than the Egyptian mummification. And the pottery goes back to 7,000 BC. So clearly something is going on in that region, in that vast region.
Yeah, I mean, because with North Africa, I mean, when I have like discussions with different people at North Africa, a lot of people like, well, they try to refer to when did people start lightening up in North Africa, for example, you know, because when we're trying to explain about, well, we're talking about the mummy in Libya, you can clearly see it's Africoid as black people, Egyptians. But so when we just say at the time period when Europeans or Eurasians started coming in heavily, changing the phenotype in North Africa. I mean, I've read Chancellor William's book where he was talking about 2181 BC of some European type, but it was very interesting. Like, but if you are aware of anything like that, when did like we start the changing basically in North Africa the face?
Yeah, here's what the controversy is. This is what the controversy is. Among the Berbers of North Africa, there are non-blacks among.
That's right.
Now, that's not the way it's usually presented. It's usually presented as the Berbers are white. I don't say that. I say among the Berbers are non-blacks.
That's right.
That's the correct way to present it.
Yeah.
The original Berbers of North Africa were indeed black people, and they were indeed of sub-Saharan origins, and that's not controversial anymore.
Yeah.
So where did these non-black Berbers come from? Well, there is an ancient source that says a population who were not black like the Moors. And that's the phrase that appears, not black like the Moors. And
right.
Who are these people? Now, one theory is that they are traceable back to the sea peoples.
Sea peoples.
And the sea peoples.
Yeah.
For people listening, sea is SEA, people coming in from the sea.
Yeah.
And these people coming in from Europe, and they were battling Egypt during the time of Ramesses III. And that could well be the origins of these non-black Berbers. So the time of Ramesses III. Now, Ramesses III, using the correct chronology, is about 1,200 BC.
Yeah.
So that would be your significant presence. Now, were there non-Africans in Africa before that? Well, you mentioned 2181 BC, which is the first intermediate period using the short chronology. If we use a longer chronology, the first intermediate period becomes 4,200 BC. And there could well have been non-Africans in Africa during that time period.
Right, yeah.
Right. It has been theorized that when Pharaoh Name, or Menes, the very first king of Egypt, was battling the lower Egyptians, among the lower Egyptian population were non-Africans as well. Now, the further back we go, though, the harder this becomes to be tenable, because the evidence suggests that everybody on the planet Earth was black before 8,000 years ago. And so when we use the long chronology, we're going back these kind of dates, it becomes harder to sustain. Certainly, we can trace the origins of non-Africans in Egypt during the first intermediate period. Definitely, because they're in the documents. There's a document called the Admonitions of Ipuwer, where he talks about Asiatics have come to Egypt and they have thrust the Kemetans aside. There's that in the document.
Yeah. But Dr. John Hendrik Clark, that's what I can always remember speaking on, the Asiatics, the Hyksoks, and all these different time periods where they were coming into Egypt. But this time period, what we were just saying before King Name, the date we're given 3,100 BC. So before this time, he's obviously coming to take something back. When I say take something back, I mean reinstall what was once there before. Because once we get invasions, to keep the African culture intact, it just seems to dissolve. Like, so when
that's the way Chancellor Williams presents it.
Yeah, yeah. How would you present it?
Professor Williams overstates the role of non-Africans in ancient Egypt.
Definitely, yeah.
Now, I don't blame him for doing so. He was trying to make a theory consistent. But what he didn't know was the evidence that he was using to support that theory wasn't real. He didn't know that Eurocentric Egyptologists were lying to him. That was really the crux of the problem.
Yeah.
So Professor Williams thought he had three pieces of evidence. He thought he had three pieces of evidence that suggested that a significant proportion of ancient Egypt wasn't black. And the three pieces of evidence was people were classifying ancient Egyptian as Afro-Asiatic. He didn't realize that that was dishonesty. Then you had people were saying that the ancient Egyptian art, the use of the color red in ancient Egypt, he thought that that was the Egyptians taking on more of a mixed character and distinguishing the red from the black. Nowadays, we've got a more sophisticated understanding of that. And then the third error that Professor Williams made was there were documents where the ancient Egyptians said horrible things about black people. And there's even a document where one of the pharaohs bans black people from setting foot in Egypt. And that document is called the Stela of Samna. What Professor Williams didn't know was that document had been systematically mistranslated to make it look as if that pharaoh said that. And because Professor Williams couldn't read hieroglyphics, the very first black scholar who I'm aware of who could at least read some was Professor Yusuf Ben Yochanan. And he's the first person to publish a real translation of that document, where clearly it didn't say that black people have been banned from setting foot in Egypt. And so, not realizing that the evidence that he had been faked, not realizing that the evidence that he had been misrepresented dishonestly, Professor Williams, in good faith, then had to construct a theory around it. And that's why he overplays the role of non-Africans in ancient Egypt, you see.
Right. Well, back to we're on a similar kind of topic now with, and we covered this last time, the Asiatic language family, and also the blood ties with it as well, because, E.T. a Semitic, the Semitic, how he presents a Semitic as if they're kind of like a Eurocentric type, very light and as well. So where this was dealing with the times of Ramses, so you mentioned that the Semitic were black people, or would you say
Correct,
the language, from the Asiatic language that spread into Western Asia?
This is what it is. It's unfortunate, but Egyptologists should not have, and ancient scholars should not have grouped the languages together and called them Afro-Asiatic. That's the problem. Right. They shouldn't have given it that name. So yes, you really connect Berber, you really can connect Hausa, you really can connect Cushitic, you really can connect Semitic, and you really can connect ancient Egyptian and put them together in one group. The question is, where did that group originate? And what name should we call that group? And by calling it something Asiatic, it gives the impression that the language is half from the Middle East. And it wasn't half anything. It was 100% from Africa. Yeah. You see? So the question now that scholars have been trying to work out is, where in Africa did those language groups, where did they come from? And the smart money says Ethiopia, where Ethiopia is today. Now, the scholars are not agreed where in Ethiopia. Some say it's the north, possibly where Eritrea is today. Some say it's the south, where Ethiopia shares a border with Kenya. Some say it's a bit further west, where Ethiopia is connected to Sudan. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
But somewhere abouts in East Africa, the origin of the language group that produced ancient Egyptian, that produced Berber, that produced Hausa, that produced Cushitic, and that produced Semitic, the origins of all of those places is somewhere in East Africa, quite possibly in and around where Ethiopia is today.
Right, yeah. Well, interesting. I mean, when we deal with, when he shows around it's 1200 BC, when he's showing you at the time of Ramses, and he's got like 4 different pictures there. Diop, Sheikh Anta Diop also was the first one to come up with that. So with Diop as well, you know, people consider him as the greats, definitely one of the greats in that. But the time period that Diop was dealing with, to what the evidence that supports us right now. I mean, is this a massive difference, or because some see him as the first to kind of do this, but down the line we've obviously got better, like you mentioned about Dr. Yoshi Ben Yakinen, then other scholars later on, like yourself. You know, your book, 95 Years of African History, When We Ruled, that some of the information on that is definitely, like, you're like a grandmaster yourself. When I look at some of the work you've done, and it's the way how you're able to view things as well, because we usually follow a lot of the USA, American scholars a lot of the time. But when people do it in the UK and they're really serious about it, the vocab is amazing. You know, so I really appreciate you. And last time as well, we're speaking on ancient England, Britain. So when we say Britain, we're talking about there was a red-headed race here, and there was also black curly, a brown race to black with curly hair. With the Iberians, with the Romans actually writ about these accounts.
It could well be that my image or sound is frozen.
Remember you mentioned about it last time. This is very interesting. You know, we in the UK, and these things we definitely got to know.
Yeah, what would you like me to address on that?
The evidence that supports black people being in Britain before the time of the Romans, which I'm definitely aware of. I know we've got Cheddar Man, but the time period from Stonehenge up to the time the Romans came to Britain.
Okay, let me answer that. The main problem that we have is the issue of documentation. What can we actually document? And the main problem is that the Romans were the first people to come to Britain, where we know for a fact they've got writing. So consequently, it starts with what can we document in terms of writing? And the big problem then is when it comes to trying to understand and interpret the data, without the writings, all we have then is the physical anthropology, right? Okay, so this is what the writings tell us. There was an Englishman called Alfred J. Church, and he wrote a book called Early Britain, and that book was written as part of a series of books called The Story of the Nations. And in Early Britain, we read, and I'm quoting now, the island was inhabited probably at this time, and certainly afterwards when we reach the historical period, by 2 races of men. Tacitus, writing about the end of the 1st century of our era, says that the physical character of the inhabitants of Britain differs much. One part of them, he speaks of these under the name of Silures, had dark complexions and for the most part curly hair. The other part, he said, resembled the Gauls. They had red hair and were tall of stature. So here we've got this notion then of 2 different races of people. Now, I came across a book called Prehistoric Remains of Caithness, and that was published in 1866 by an MP called Samuel Lang. And then there was a physical anthropological study by Professor Thomas Henry Huxley. And in Samuel Lang's book, we read, and I'm quoting now, "It is important and interesting fact that in association with these very rude and primitive remains, a type of human race should have been discovered so savage and degraded as to present more resemblance to the lowest Australian than to any historical European race." lowest Australian Aborigine. Now, of course, many people would get caught up in the anti-black, the racist language.
Yeah.
That my thing is, let's put that aside. Let's just get to the meat. So here we have a book, Prehistoric Remains of Caithness, where they are saying that the population in Britain at that time is closer in appearance to the Australian Aborigines than to any other group of Europeans. Now, until relatively recently, there was no other source to go on other than this 1866 book. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Until the discovery of Cheddar Man. And then with the discovery of Cheddar Man and similar cheddar-like findings in Ireland, I have a newspaper article where it says, first Irish population had dark skin similar to Cheddar Man, DNA research suggests. And then I came across another article on Russia Today called Documentary About Dark-Skinned First Swedes Sparks Horror on Twitter. So people are kicking off. So in other words, it's not just Cheddar Man, it's black populations in other parts of the far north of Europe as well. So the question we now need to ask ourselves is, did the population from the Cheddar Man period down to the Stonehenge period, did the population stay the same or did it change? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I have seen evidence that the population may have changed. I've got a BBC News article where it says ancient Britons replaced by newcomers. Now the question is did the replacement take place before the building of Stonehenge or after the building of Stonehenge? Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course.
And unfortunately, the data that the BBC article, it's on the fence. It doesn't say definitively before or after. It says about the same time. And so consequently, we can't then say, well, Cheddar Man's people built Stonehenge because it could have been a new population. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But this new population were probably not the Celts. The Celts came later. And this new population, there's no evidence that they were Caucasians. No evidence yet. Now, there may be evidence that will turn up to make that claim, but right this minute, we don't actually know. So when it comes to that, I sit right on the fence.
Right. So when we're dealing with the North, I mean, like Northern Asia, Northern Europe, like the Mongoloid race that they speak on, then you got like in India, now I'm aware of like the first peoples going into China, India, where black peoples, I met a lot of them in Southeast Asia, they're still there, the original peoples. So what do you reckon is, how did the Mongol type race and also in the Northern Asia, basically, is it due to the Ice Age? And, I'm aware of what happened during the Ice Age, and then what changed the complexion, like, of vast numbers, like Chancellor William mentioned in his book about in the destruction of the black civilization, about China, ancient China and the Far East is a very important study for black history, about the amount of Africans now when we say Africans, this goes back to what we were saying last time. We can't call them African, we have to call them indigenous black peoples of those lands.
Correct, yeah. All right, let me answer that. As far as we know, non-black populations did not originate in the Ice Age, as far as we know. And the reason why we can now say that is because they're not old enough. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
When Professor Sheikh Anta Diop wrote Civilization or Barbarism, a new anthropology, when that book came out, it was believed that non-African appearances emerged during the Worm-3 interglacial. Scholars don't believe that anymore because non-African appearances simply aren't that old. So one theory that is the anthropologists are running with now is that around 9000 BC, a particular gene emerged called SLC24A5. And that gene depigments whoever has it by 32.5% of its skin coloring. So if you've got that gene, you would be darker than somebody with one African parent and one European parent. You'd be darker than that.
Okay, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then around 8,000 years ago, a second gene appeared called SLC45A2. And if you've got that gene, it depigments you by 60% of your skin coloring. And so if that happens, you would be a little bit lighter than someone with one African and one European parent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So if you've got both genes, SLC24A5, and you've been depigmented by 32.5%, and the second gene, SLC45A2, and you've been depigmented by 60%, you've got both genes, you've been depigmented by 92.5%. That's where we get the European complexion.
Okay.
Get it? So consequently, people of non-African complexions didn't really exist until 8,000 years ago.
Very recent.
And so consequently, yes, very recent. And I am told that there are some anthropologists willing to cut that figure of 8,000 years ago down to 6,000 years ago. I'm even hearing some people making that claim. I was interviewed for a documentary that one of my colleagues from back in the day is now making about human origins. And the physical anthropologists he spoke to, let's say 6,000 years ago.
Wow, see?
Which is sounding very, very much like the kind of thing that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad would have said. And that's kind of scary, to be honest. That's scary.
The biblical timeline kind of matches.
Yeah, I mean...
Coincidence.
As I said, back in the day, yeah. So what it now means then is that we can't now connect non-African skin complexions to the Ice Age because the whole thing is just too recent.
That's amazing new news, that though. That's really amazing because that was the excuse for everything. That was the excuse, you know. And it just really...
let me give you one interesting thing here. The information I mentioned about those two genes, I got it from a newspaper. Have a guess which newspaper? The least likely newspaper to have dropped that information. The Daily Mail.
The Daily Mail. Wow.
The article is called "How White Skin Evolved in Europeans. Pale complexions only spread in the region 8,000 years ago," study claims. And this is the 6th of April, 2015.
Wow.
Yeah, Daily Mail.
Wow. See, this is what I mean. Even when they first showed Cheddar Man being black in Britain, you know, that was a big sparkle. And then you mentioned about Sweden before.
Yeah.
You know, so it's unbelievable, like, you know. Well, it just shows you. And then with China, see, like, how would you explain the Mongoloid race? The reason why I asked that is because you refer to the Khoisan people who, you know, with the Bushmen and South Africa and these places, they refer like they went into Asia. Now, the oldest African, would you say where the Khoisan, or would you go with the pygmy type?
It could have been one or the other.
Yeah.
It could have been one or the other. It's quite possible that the very earliest people, very earliest humans, could have been Khoisan in appearance. They could have been pygmy in appearance.
Yeah. So
so one group of black folks or another group of black folks. You know?
Because what it was with Eurocentric, I know they always like to choose the light. They always look for the lightest to try to say this is the beginning of something. You know, sort of like the look of trying to look what's closer to themselves. I'm not, you know.
You you will get that. But my view is, you know, one group of black folks or another group of black folks. I'm easy, whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll
I
take
mean,
it whichever way.
the problem, what it is, it's not even the fact of, it's the fact when someone is writing your history for you, like when we're dealing with the time of the Hebrews, because a lot of people say, well, what color were the Hebrews and the time period that they came into Egypt? You know, would you say they were the Hyksos? They match it with the Hyksos, would you say?
Yeah. That's what the documents say.
Yeah.
And it's hard to argue with the documents because we've only really got one source, and that's what we know, one source. This is what it is. What we know about ancient Egypt's history from an ancient Egyptian perspective is from an ancient Egyptian historian called Manetho. Now, Manetho's book isn't written in Egyptian hieroglyphics, it's written in Greek, because he was writing it for a Greek pharaoh, Pharaoh Ptolemy Philadelphus. And he was writing it for a Greek audience, and unfortunately, his original hasn't survived. All we have is different people quoting it. And what happens is the ancient Jewish scholar, Josephus, he quotes the bit on the Hyksos, and then he quotes it, and then he puts his own comment. And his own comment says, and the Hyksos were our people. Our, meaning our Jewish brethren. And he goes on to say that when the Hyksos were kicked out of Egypt, they were kicked out and they ended up fleeing to the Middle East, where they built a city called Hiroslima. Hiroslima is Jerusalem.
Right, okay.
Do you see? That's
yeah.
How we know. Now, some people will say, but Robin, that's just one ancient scholar running up their mouths. And it might be. But if we delete Josephus, we also have to delete the Hyksos because he was the one that said it.
Yeah.
Quoting Manetho. So we can't just split it where we keep the Hyksos and then diss the Jewish link. We either eat both, you know, like you're eating a meal. We either have the fish and the chips. We can't have the fish and then throw away the chips.
Oh yeah, picking and choosing.
Yeah, you can't do that. So yes, so if that's the case, if we accept the Hyksos existed and we accept that they were conquerors coming in from the Middle East, then we have to accept the source that we got it from, which is Josephus quoting and then commenting on Manetho.
And a little bit before that time period, which all kind of interlinked anyway, the Canaanites in Israel. You know, when people refer to the people of those lands, another thing, the same with with this Eurocentric Egyptologist, and at this time period, the Canaanites would have been black people.
I'm not so sure.
How would you?
Let me clarify that. Everybody, including Eurocentric scholars, everybody's agreed that the very first people to have a culture in what is today Israel stroke Palestine stroke Lebanon. Everyone's agreed the first people there to have a culture were the Natufians.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone is agreed that the Natufians were black. There's no doubt there, there's nothing to discuss. The question is, did the population stay consistent from the Natufian period through the Canaanite period through to the Phoenician period? That's now what we're discussing. Does that make sense? Yeah. Now, I've looked at Canaanite art, and some of it definitely looks Negro.
Definitely.
Some of it, but I wouldn't claim all of it. Does that make sense? I wouldn't claim all of it. Similarly, the Phoenicians. I studied some of the Phoenician. There's a series of Phoenician art pieces called the Nimrod ivories. And the Nimrod ivories, the majority of them are clearly Negro. But same thing, I wouldn't claim all of it. You see, I wouldn't claim all of it. So that's the reason why I would exercise some caution. Now, the Jewish city of Lachish has indeed been excavated. And what was found was 695 skulls. And they were studied by a scholar called D.L. Risden. I don't know whether that's pronounced Risden or Risden, and he concluded that they were Upper Egyptian in origin.
Right.
Now, let that sink in. Let that sink in.
Egyptian in origin.
Yeah. For those people that were listening who are unclear what that means, Upper Egypt is southern Egypt.
Yeah.
Not northern Egypt, southern Egypt. And if you go to Upper Egypt today, the population is, shall we say, dark. Let me just put it like that.
Yeah, definitely. So moving to we can quickly move to West Africa just before we finish off. What's the oldest civilization you find in West Africa? Because we heard about the Songhai, we obviously heard about the Nok culture and Timbuktu, but what was the oldest would you find in West Africa?
Okay, there were a series of findings that the archaeologists discovered. There was an archaeologist called Patrick J. Munson, and he wrote about this, and it appeared in the Journal of African History. Now, Journal of African History is mainstream Eurocentric claptrap, but on this occasion, they dropped some science. And what they discovered were stone structures near the city of Walata. They call the whole region Dar Tichit Walata. On a modern map that's in Mauritania, they found stone structures and they dated them to 1100 BC. What then happened was the person behind the Journal of African Civilizations, his name was Roland Oliver, he republished the material and said it was 1400 BC. And then the material has been redated, and one of the professors of archaeology, Kevin MacDonald, who's a professor of archaeology at the Institute of Archaeology in Central London, he told me personally that they now think it's 2000 BC. And he went further. It's the same date as the Sudanese city of Kerma. Whatever date you put Kerma at, that's the date that you put Dar Tichit Walata. Now, I've seen photographs of those ruins, and they're impressive. They're Great Zimbabwe-esque. Right? They're impressive. Right? So that tells us that West Africans were building in stone 4,000 years ago. Then by the time we get to about 800 BC, West Africans had cities, and you had cities all the way along the Niger. And these cities meant that when we're talking about ancient history, ordinarily we would talk about how the Nile is an important place of civilization, how the Tigris and Euphrates is an important place of civilization, how the Indus River is an important place of civilization. Now scholars are talking about the Niger in West Africa as a place of civilization. And then from these places, you get Ghana, you get Mali, you get Songhai. Now,
okay, so we'll continue with West Africa. You were talking about the oldest civilizations, and you mentioned a lot. You were talking about before the Songhai times, and so we could continue where we were up to before, speaking on West Africa, and then we can move to Central Africa.
Yeah, so in the case of West Africa, another area of high culture is the Nok region of Nigeria, where fine sculptures were discovered that were dated between 1000 BC and 300 BC. Okay. Now, the Nok site itself has been dated to before 4280 BC, I think. So the site is old, but when we're actually looking at a culture being there, we're really talking about 1000 BC to 300 BC. A series of sculptures have been found. Some people put the figure at between 400 plus sculptures, and that they are thought to have been made by African women, and they are splendid. When we're dealing with, if you like, a documented history, it really is, though, the rise and fall of ancient Ghana, medieval Mali, and the Songhai Empire. And of those, Ghana is very sparsely documented, but Mali is fully documented, Songhai is fully documented. In fact, Songhai is so well documented, me and my team, we were able to write a book called everyday life in an early West African empire, where we could even reconstruct the food that they were eating. We could reconstruct some of their stuff to do with their music. We could reconstruct the different the royal rituals. There was a lot that we were able to reconstruct.
Interesting. And we heard about, say, things like in Congo, the oldest mathematical tool, the Ishanga bone, dating to about 20,000 to 25,000 years ago. I mean, how old can we go? Because your book is very interesting. You covered a lot of different things going back to 90,000 years, which that was amazing. I mean, how did you even begin with your journey? Because that's what I actually need to deal with as well. Your journey. What was Robin Walker's journey first dealing with Black history from the beginning to where you are now?
It took place in a number of stages. At the very beginning, like most Black people of my age group, I didn't think that Black people had any history, because the way the mass media presents it is they present it in such a way as to let you think that Black people don't have any history. So that was my view. I believe that Africa was jungle and desert right up until when the Europeans came and civilized us.
Yeah.
I didn't realize there was real history in Africa. Now, what happened was, when I was in the middle of my university days, I moved into a household where the man was Ghanaian and the woman was Trinidadian.
Okay.
And they had a book in their book collection called The Destruction of Black Civilization by Professor Chancellor James Williams. I read that book. I promised myself that when I graduated, I would read that book from cover to cover, even if I have to force myself to read it. And that was my beginnings right there. So my beginnings was in 1990. I read Chancellor Williams's book. I think I read it about 3 or 4 times. I've since read it 5 times.
Yeah.
That was the beginnings. Now, at that time, I didn't know that when you're writing history, you're supposed to lay out your case like you're laying out a court case. Evidence, 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 evidence. Now, Professor Williams doesn't write like that. He just tells you no evidence presented. So while I was very uncomfortable about the fact that no evidence was presented, I knew enough how to check an intellectual argument. My main study at university was economics, and my second study was philosophy. And what philosophy teaches you to do is how to check an argument. And as I started checking what the mainstream scholars were saying, I started to realize that Professor Williams could be right. Not was right, could be. I came across Ben Jochannan. What I used to do outside of academics, I used to be in a jazz orchestra, and one of the musicians that I worked with was Courtney Pine, and Courtney was into Ben Jochannan. Now, Ben Jochannan's books are very confrontational, the way they're written, but they're very evidence-based. And he will tell you, if you don't believe me, check out this reference, this reference. I was very impressed. And then eventually other people got me into Diop, and other people got me into Jackson. And then from there, I got into Van Sertima. And then I got into white scholars, particularly Basil Davidson. And what Davidson had that the Black scholars didn't have is photographs of ancient and medieval African monuments, ancient and medieval African art and monuments that Professor Williams said had all been destroyed. And then I realized, wait a minute, we've been fooled. The stuff hasn't all been destroyed. You see, the next development was I was teaching Black studies at a largely Ghanaian center in North London. And one of the organizers of my course gave me a book called Living Cultures of Nigeria. And in that book, it had, among other things, some of the boots that was collected by the British Museum, and the boots were made in Kano on a modern map where Nigeria is today. And that was when I realized we've been played. Yeah. And the research that I've done since then has been to strengthen that. So when I put pen to paper the first time round, I wrote a book called Classical Splendor, Roots of Black History. And what that book did was, that was the knowledge I had then. I updated that book in 2006, where it became When We Ruled. And When We Ruled has got as many photographs as I could get my hands on and could afford to pay for, to put in to show that ancient African heritage still exists. It wasn't all destroyed. There's manuscripts, no one's talking about. There's fine art, no one's talking about. There's jewelry, no one's talking about. There's architecture, no one's talking about. And there's inscriptions, no one's talking about. And my job is to put all of that in one book so people can see.
Amazing. No, you don't. You've done really what I do like about the way you were able to find different pieces of evidence, but combine it together, which I feel that a lot of even some what we call the greats, it was sometimes they weren't able to make them connections as strong. Like you can make connections, but it was like, well, you either believe this or you believe this. It was like no in between sometimes. And this is modern day that we're in now. We've got to move forward in how we're doing things and learning things and that, you know. But also, you know, let's keep it going. I'm enjoying this anyway. And so moving on to other parts of Africa, like say Central Africa, Congo, or we could deal with Kenya. You got like the Maasai tribes. I encountered the Maasai tribe myself. Very interested in history. And then I'm meeting Bantu people in Kenya, because as I was going on the Messiah tour, the man who's taking me, he's telling me he's not Nilo, he's Bantu. So what I found then is that he is closely related to West Africans more than the Nilo-Saharan is. So closer to ourselves. And that's when I started actually learning about the Bantu migration, and so interesting. So yourself, I mean, have you been to Africa? Have you been to parts of Africa yourself? Within Africa?
Yeah. The very first place I went to was Kenya. And my business in going to Kenya was to explore the East African cities. So I stayed in Malindi. I visited Gedi, Jumba na Mtwana, Mnarani, and various other sites along the East African coast. And I went there armed with a camera. So that was very, very important for me. So that was Kenya. That was the first place I went to. I also visited Gambia. That was a holiday. And it was during the holiday, by the way, that I finished the book, Everyday Life in an Early West African Empire. Since then, I was invited to take part in some African Union activities. So I'm a member of an African Union body called CEDAW, which means Citizens and Diaspora Organization.
Okay.
We've had a meeting in Ghana. We've had a meeting in Sierra Leone. We had a meeting in Senegal. And then based on that, one of the other members of CEDAW, his name is Professor Adama Senaseku. He invited me to Mali, and they looked after me for 9 days in Mali. So I was able to visit the Bamako Museum, and I was able to visit the librarian. There's a famous librarian in Mali. His name is, what's his name? Abdul Kader Haidara. And he is the person that controls the Haidara collection. So he's got access to thousands and thousands of manuscripts because he's the biggest businessman buying the ancient manuscripts. And I was able to see them and see them at work. So that was very, very powerful for me. But of all the places, I saw the most ancient history was in Kenya, because obviously I was able to see the cities of Gedi, Jumba na Mtwana, and so on, and get the photographs as well.
Excellent. Yeah. Because it's interesting. I mean, Africa so big, isn't it? And then even like South Africa, you know what I mean? They have old civilizations, which we have to always look for what the Europeans say all the time. I mean, how can, in order for more black scholars in academia, you know, what could, is it about the motivation for the younger people? They've got to be a bit excited about it in order to make this grow. Because sometimes people, they're not interested. Sometimes they focus on this, and you know, they're not on that tip. So, you know, I'm totally in the Pan-African. You know, like yourself, it's a, you know, it's entered in that. Once you
let me tell you one.
Yeah, that's it.
This is what it is. This is what it is. The reason why so many young people are not interested in it is a lot of the older people are not making the history age appropriate, relevant.
Interesting. Wow.
You can't talk big people things for little person. They're not ready yet. You have to talk big people things to big people.
Yeah.
And you have to think from a young person's perspective, what would interest them, not what would interest you, what would interest them. And a lot of adults don't understand that when you're teaching young people. So you're teaching things that you think are important, but they're not at the age to know that those things are important. So you have to meet them where they are. Now, when it comes to dealing with older people, that's a different story. Now, if people realized, for example, that the empire, Mutapa is where Great Zimbabwe is today, and it spread into South Africa, had a social welfare system where they looked after the blind and the disabled. Yes, they did. You'd want to study that.
Yeah.
If you knew that the East African coast, multi-story houses with bathrooms and toilets were a thing, you'd want to study that. You see, Gene houses. Gene is in West Africa, where Ghana, Mali, and Songhai is. All of them were connected in Gene. Had 15th and 16th century houses that are still there, that also have indoor toilets on the top floor. If people knew that, again, you'd want to study. But what happens is that it's not presented to the Black community in ways that would interest them. And this is where I come in, because I know what to say to interest you, me, anybody else in the history, because I know what's relevant. So what happens is you'll get books written by Eurocentric scholars like Graham Connor, where he'll write a book and he'll present some content, but none of it relevant or interesting to Black people. So none of us will buy it because it's not saying anything. And he'll mention in a footnote something that is important, but it's in a footnote. And I think it was his book. If it's not your book, Graham, sorry for dissing you, but I think it was your book. He mentioned in a footnote that the city of Benin in Nigeria is in the Guinness Book of Records as the largest construction works in the world carried out prior to mechanical times. You can't put that in a footnote. That has to be in the body of the text.
Definitely.
And that can't be something that you mention in passing. That has to be the first thing you say.
Yeah.
You see? Yeah.
It's like when I was reading an old world history book several years ago, written by a European, and I'm just reading it as just, you know, dealing with the beginning of time and up to basic history and evolution and everything. World history book. And I remember reading, I just seen a little word in there, reading about the Huns part. And I just seen one word saying Black Huns. Just one word. So just through looking at that one word, and I didn't feel that I expanded on what it said. So just that one word, I just made research out of it myself and then started seeing there was some Black people in the Huns army. And I was like, these are the shocking things. And then, Black people served in a lot of different armies and still doing to this day. What's happening today is different, I suppose, like in the Roman army and different armies. And then, I mean, back in when we're going in time, what we know as racism now, when Black people were in the Roman army, would you say that there was still that racism there, or was it? It's not like until is it more or less till the transatlantic slave trade we see racism as we know it, or would you say it existed before that? Some people touch on the caste system in India going back. So, what do you make of these?
That's what I think. Yeah, that's what I think. Yeah, racism in the Roman Empire certainly was a thing, but it wasn't the thing that it is today. I watched a televised series called Rome. I think it was called Rome. And obviously it was set in ancient Rome. It was all dramatized. Now, how racism played out, nobody said you black, this, that, and the other. No one said that to anybody. But if you were a non-Roman citizen and you looked at a Roman soldier the wrong way, he could break your arm and you couldn't do a damn thing about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, they were
Moreover, if you saw a black person in Rome, he was almost certainly, or she was almost certainly, a colonized, conquered person from Africa. If you consider that the Romans at one time had taken over Egypt, Libya, what's today Algeria, what's today Morocco, what's today whatever. All of that area was taken over. That meant that if you saw a black person, you already knew he was a colonized subject. Yeah. You might not have called him, you black, what's it? But once you're a colonized subject, you look at a Roman soldier the wrong way, he can break your arm.
Yeah. Right.
Now, did black people get to the top of the Roman hierarchy? Yes. Did they get to the top of the Roman hierarchy and be accepted? Yes. Yeah. And if we look at the Roman discoveries in Britain, we know that there was a black woman of extremely high status buried in York. Some people call her the Ivory Bangle Lady. And according to the Daily Mail, that wonderful source of British conservatism, they describe her as a queen. That's the word they're using. Yeah. We know that there was another black woman of very high status because her mansion or whatever it is has been discovered. Beachy Head Lady. She's in Essex or Sussex or one of them places.
Ipswich, I've seen. There was a black presence in Ipswich.
Yeah.
I'm not sure the date of that one as well. So they're just coming out.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I would say then is racism against black people, the way it is today, did not exist during the Roman period. But as I said, if you were colonized, don't look at a Roman soldier the wrong way.
Yeah.
Don't look the wrong way. Now, racism as we know it today is probably the Hindu caste system.
Definitely.
Yeah? And that's probably 1500 BC, if not earlier.
Yeah. I remember that I did a Zoom with Dr. Renaud Rashidi before he passed about a year ago. And we were speaking about the caste system in India, which he talked heavily on anyway. And what we were trying to do is looking at what does the European usually say about it? Because he usually says, like, well, some of them don't believe it. Well, not the European, it's the...
No, it's the Hindus that don't believe it.
It's the Hindus, yeah, that's what I mean, yeah. So whether or not they are related to the Indo-Europeans going way back, besides the point in that...
They are.
Yeah, but what they believe, like you just said, they didn't, like they were always there, the North were always light-skinned, So that there is very interesting because we can look at both cases when you're talking about presenting the case. And then some of the modern ones blamed when Britain went to India. Like some people try to blame that, so it's, you blame.
They tried to blame Professor Mortimer Wheeler, and then they accused Mortimer Wheeler of inventing the Aryan invasion theory.
Exactly.
He didn't invent it.
Yeah. So, like you said.
But let me answer that question. Let me answer that. In my school teaching days, I've worked with Hindu teachers, and one of them was quite raw in how he summed it up. He said, the people of India are basically of two tribes. That's the way he describes it. One tribe is Dravidian, and they are black like Africans. That's what he said. and another tribe is Aryans, and they are white like Europeans. There it is. Yeah.
Simple.
Yeah, in other words, clarity. And he presented it with clarity. There was no messing about. There was no half stepping. Yeah.
That's it. I mean, India's got like quite a. They've even got the Mongols in Northeast Asia, Northeast India. They've got a bit Chinese.
That's right. That's right.
A big melting pot, isn't it? India, and then the Australian lookalike type in India. Very similar.
Yeah, so your Dravidians, the Dravidians are your Australian lookalikes.
Yeah.
And then you've also got recent Africans from Africa that became the ruling class underneath the kings during the Muslim period.
The CDs we're talking about?
The CDs, yeah. And they've got a glorious history in India as well.
And so, you know, when we speak about when they came to India, the CDs, would you say they came as, well, obviously they were in, you know, the Arab enslavement in Africa, and aware of that. They got taken to India, and even I heard some of China even as well during the Tang Dynasty times. So dealing with,
and they became the ruling class.
But they became the ruling class. Now that's a big difference to how we came into the Europe or America, you know. So yeah, very interesting. So while we're on the topic of that, dealing with Arabia, when we dealing with Black Arabia and the times of Muhammad or before Muhammad. So we're dealing with it when it was more Black people in Arabia. What changed the face of Arabia? Was it, would you say, a time from when the Roman period, or could it be like some of these Turks? Because you've got a lot of different Turks, haven't you? So many different.
That's right.
Turks.
That's right. Another thing too that would have changed the population is the Arabs were equal opportunity enslavers.
Yeah.
They enslaved people from Africa, but they also enslaved people from Eastern Europe. And this is one of the reasons Eastern Europeans got the nickname Slav, which they've never been able to shake off.
Yeah, the Slav.
So a lot of pale Arabs today are actually Slavs.
Wow. Eastern European.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
The difference is that because what's happened with the ones that are mixed with Slav is they've become accepted into the Arab world. So a lot of pale Arabs, they won't admit that they're actually Slavic. As far as they're concerned, they're Arab.
Yeah.
And what they've tried to do is to make it look like the only people that got enslaved were Africans, you see. And in this way, they've been able to rewrite history.
Right, yeah.
You see.
You know the Mamelukes.
Yeah. Them and the Slavs overlap. They're the same population.
Same population, yeah. Whether they ended up, some of them in what we call the Middle East, or now.
And they're the people that we would today call white Arabs, do you see?
That's right, yeah. Because in Chancellor Williams's book, when he's describing white Arabs, some people can be thinking what he's writing, because of, we can go from brown Arabs as well. You can say black Arab, but also there's people like just like brown, then there's one very light. So that was the thing with, like, when he says white Arab. So that's why I was like wondering when he's putting that Eastern European blood ties. But it's funny how when you say that, not only are they accepted, they would be considered, would you say, the ruling class of what we call Arabia?
Yeah. So what's happened is that they become that to such an extent that when we think of an Arab, it's them that we're thinking of.
That's right. Yeah, it is, and it's already in people's heads that automatically.
Yeah.
So with North Africa as well, North Africa would be, because there's been a lot of European influences and invasions over years, and that would, because I remember going to Morocco. Now I know you got southern Morocco, a lot more black people down there, but very pale. And I was like very shocked when I first got to Morocco. I didn't expect it to be very European looking. Not even just so much Arab looking, very European looking.
Yeah. And part of that is we talked about the sea peoples going back 1,200 BC, and then ending up in that area. Then you've also got the Arab slave trade to North Africa, which brought in again Slavs into that region. Then you've also got the Turkish occupation, and then bringing in even more Slavs, and gradually ends up with them as the majority. Yeah. And then, of course, you've got the way that white scholars will try to make the Berbers, the core ones, white, and the slave class black, when in reality, the original Berbers were originally fully black until they were joined by non-black ones. And then, of course, you've also got the fact that the Romans ruled North Africa from between 146 BC and 639 AD.
Yeah.
And the Roman, and so no one talks about them either, because the idea is to try to minimize that. You know, so that this is so consequently, when we're dealing with white North Africans, this is where all those populations are coming from. There was also a Vandal invasion as well. The Vandals are from Germany, and they conquered North Africa in the 5th century AD. Their descendants are still there.
Yep, that's right. So even though when the Arabs came into North Africa, it wasn't a case of get the Roman out. It was it just a case of just if you convert, then that was fine.
Absolutely. And so what then happened?
He should have kicked them out, but he didn't. You just convert. So that's like forgiving people. It's just forgiveness if you convert. And we've seen this story a bit around the time of Akhenaten. You know, allowing some people, well, you should have just kicked them out. Like, you know, we sometimes a bit like, well, come with the one God, then and follow the laws. But it's not really understanding barbarian people, though. If people are barbarian, the barbarians.
What it is, though, is a lot of our ancestors were very, very naive when it came to dealing with populations that don't believe what you believe.
Yeah.
The idea of wiping a population out completely, that's not how we did things. And it resulted in us being very, very naive, not taking military matters seriously, more naivety, you know, just a whole bunch of naivety that came together, producing the result that Chancellor Williams calls the destruction of black civilization.
So our kindness, because I've always seen this African as the kindness, where the rest of the world is very racially aware, you know.
Yeah. And it's an issue. Now, at one time, we used to be able to connect this to the two cradle theorem that Sheikh Anta Diop was talking about. But because Europeans evolved a lot more recently, we can't make that argument anymore. Yeah. So we're not entirely sure what our historic naivety was based on.
Right. Yeah. Well, Well, we've got a little bit of time left. Do you want to speak on some of your books? Some of your books that you've written.
Well, the most important thing is my course.
Your course, okay. Let's speak on that as well.
Yeah. Okay. My most important book is When We Ruled, and When We Ruled is a general history of black people from ancient times right up until about 1957. It's ancient civilizations, it's medieval civilizations, and it's a little bit of the last 200 years, but only a little bit. And based on that, I then wrote a course called The Black Secret. So you can Google it, The Black Secret Education Project. And what that does is give access to my classes online. So if you want to watch them at 3 o'clock in the morning, you can. If you want to watch them at 6 o'clock in the morning, you can. If you want to start a class and then freeze it and then come back to it when you've got time to get with it, you can. And what the Black Secret does is to break down the content of When We Ruled and to put the content that's not in When We Ruled together to give the most comprehensive black history I am aware of to date. Whoever has got anything more than me, I want to know. So it's called the Black Secret Education Project. I've since written books on Black people in science, Blacks in Science, volumes 1, 2, and 3. I've written books on religion, Blacks and Religion, volumes 1 and 2. I've written a book on African mathematics. I've written some other stuff as well. But the main point is to revolutionize Black history teaching and Black social studies teaching so that you can talk about STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, from our perspective. You can talk about religion from our perspective, and you can talk about some of the other subjects as well from our perspective. And so that's what I do. So I write books, but most importantly, I'm interesting people in the Black Secret Education Project, and it's an online course. People can subscribe to it, and they can get access to my filmed content. So it's filmed in a North London, no, it was filmed in a South London classroom. So you join the class, essentially. You join the class, the PowerPoints are there, the content is there, you can test yourself afterwards, and you can teach yourself Black history.
Very interesting. And yeah, well, definitely we offer the, if you got a link to, you can send me a link to any of them, or even if you got a link to put up on.
Okay, let me put something in the chat.
Yeah, so just so the viewers can see. And I'm enjoying this conversation anyway. You know, I'm happy. Happy we've got you back on. Also, I do events sometimes. I did before Renault Rashidi passed. He was able to come to Liverpool Caribbean Centre because he was doing a tour around Europe, and so I got in touch with him. Did the event with him in the Caribbean. That was 2020 January. He wasn't able to come back. You know. Mm-hmm. He wasn't able to come back, so we had to do a Zoom later on before he passed away and that. So hopefully maybe if you're ever coming down to Liverpool sometime soon, we could maybe organise an event, you know. But
no problem.
That'd be great. It's been excellent today though anyway, you know, I've really enjoyed it, you know, and it's been anticipated from the last time we spoke. And I feel like we've been able to cover more. We've definitely covered a lot more today. We've actually gone a lot longer. So things happen for the reason. So I want to thank you very much, Rob Walker. This is James Diboe on Discovering Season 5, dedicated to original peoples. And big thanks again. Bless up. And I appreciate you.
No problem at all, sir.
Yes. We should have this.
Thank you very much. And the Black Secrets, the link is in the chat.
The link is in the chat anyway. So, yeah. Well, thank you very much, Rob Walker. And we'll do this again one time. And we'll keep in touch. Thank you. Bless.
Thank you. Have a good one. Thanks for inviting me. Okay, then. Bye-bye.